It's funny, the things that stick with you. I was just remembering this ridiculous notion I had as a teenager, fueled by a medical school lecture, no less,
Oh, yeah.
that I could become a sword swallower just because I didn't have much of a gag reflex. Spent ages trying with a fishing rod, completely clueless.
Huh. That actually perfectly sets the stage for what we're diving into today. How easily we can misinterpret the world or even, well, our own abilities when we lack some fundamental understanding.
Exactly. Your assumption about your gag reflex wasn't the full picture, was it?
Not even close.
It wasn't until years later when I actually met a sword swallower as a patient that I learned the crucial missing piece. The throat isn't round, it's flat. All that teenage effort based on a totally wrong mental model.
And that's what brings us here, really,
Yeah.
precisely. You, our listener, have pointed us to some compelling material, most notably Hans Rosling's Factfulness. Our mission today is to extract the core insights from these sources, challenge the flawed assumptions we all make,
Right.
and hopefully equip you with a clearer, maybe less overwhelming understanding of the world.
Factfulness really hits you right away with this surprising discovery. When asked basic questions about global trends, most people, and I mean most people,
Hmm.
score worse than random chance, worse than chimpanzees.
Yeah.
It really makes you stop and think, doesn't it?
It does. And the book argues that this isn't because people aren't smart, but rather because of these 10 dramatic instincts that our brains kind of default to.
Yeah.
They lead us to these systematic misunderstandings. So over the next hour or so, we'll dissect these instincts, reveal how they, distort our perspective, and
Sure.
most importantly, give you practical tools, factfulness habits, as Rosling calls them, to see the world more accurately and maybe feel a bit less anxious about it all.
Okay, sounds good. Let's get right to the first one then. The gap instinct.
Ah, yes, the gap instinct.
This is our strong tendency to see the world as divided into two distinct, often opposing groups. Like rich versus poor or developed versus developing.
Exactly. The core insight here is that this instinct creates this false sense of separation. Instead of seeing a continuous range, we perceive a large, empty gap, a chasm of injustice, as the book puts it. But reality is, well, it's far more nuanced than that.
Think about those old terms, developed world and developing world. We still hear them all the time.
We do.
But the data shows they're incredibly outdated. Rosling uses family size and child deaths as a really great example. Back in, 1965?
Yeah, around then.
There was a clear divide. But now, as the book's charts illustrate so clearly, that picture has fundamentally changed. Most countries have smaller families and far, far fewer child deaths.
The crucial takeaway really is that the developing category, as we sort of understood it back then, is almost empty now.
Huh, really?
Yeah. The vast majority of humanity, something like 85%, now lives in what used to be considered the developed world, in terms of those metrics anyway.
Wow.
Only a small fraction still experiences the conditions of that mid-20th century developing world.
And to really challenge this gap instinct in ourselves, consider this question from Factfulness. It asks, in all low-income countries across the world today, how many girls finish primary school? Is it 20%, 40%, or 60%?
And the average guess Rosalind got was shockingly low, wasn't it?
Yeah, most people guess 20%. It just reveals this deep misconception about a massive gap in basic education.
When the actual answer is 60%. As Rosling states, the gap we still see between rich and poor countries is nothing like the gap that used to be.
So instead of this simple, two-group view,
Right.
Rosling introduces 4 income levels. Level 1 is extreme poverty. Level 4 is high income. But the crucial thing to grasp is the massive number of people now in levels 2 and 3.
Exactly. They're making steady progress. The book uses relatable examples, too. Rosling talks about his own grandmother in Sweden,
Yeah.
who experienced a journey from what were essentially level 1-like conditions to level 3 within her lifetime. That tangible progress really highlights the upward movement.
And for you, the listener, maybe especially if you've always known a comfortable income, it's easy to see a sharp divide. You look down from level 4, perhaps.
Sure. But the reality is most of the world is in those middle levels now. So the actionable insight here, what should people do?
Well, resist the urge to label countries or groups as simply rich or poor. Instead, visualize those 4 income levels as a spectrum and recognize that the majority of the world occupies that middle ground. It's not just us and them.
Good point. Okay, moving on. Instinct number 2, the negativity instinct.
Ah, this one feels very familiar. Our natural tendency to focus more on the bad news than the good. It's like our mental radar is constantly scanning for threats.
Yeah, it probably served us well evolutionarily. But the core insight here is that this instinct makes us consistently underestimate progress. As Rosling puts it, the past was worse than you remember. The present is better than you think.
We tend to remember the past more fondly, maybe through rose-tinted glasses.
Right, nostalgia.
And negative events today often overshadow gradual improvements that are happening all the time.
And this negativity gets amplified by a few things, doesn't it?
Yeah, like the media understandably focuses on problems.
Yeah.
But that's what gets clicks or views.
True. And also, sometimes acknowledging progress feels, I don't know, like we're downplaying the challenges that still exist. Like it's heartless somehow.
That's a good point. There's this feeling that if we say things are getting better, maybe we'll become complacent or stop trying.
Exactly. But the crucial thing to understand, and Rosling hammers this home, is that things can be both bad and getting better at the same time.
Right. It's not either.
Progress isn't about everything being perfect. It's about things improving over time, even if there are still serious issues.
And let's be real, bad news grabs our attention way more. A plane crash makes headlines for days.
But the millions of safe flights don't. Of course not. That creates a really skewed perception of risk.
Yeah.
And what's fascinating is how our increased global connectivity actually contributes to this negativity bias.
How so?
Well, we hear about problems in more places than ever before. Suffering anywhere can feel like suffering everywhere, which can create the impression that the world is getting worse overall, even if many key metrics are improving globally. As Rosling notes, news is about things that are unusual. News is about exceptions. The unusual problems get more news than the usual improvements.
Okay, so how do we fight this negativity bias in our daily lives? What's the actionable step?
Expect bad news. Seriously, just expect it. Recognize that negative events are more likely to be reported.
Okay.
But, and this is the key, when you encounter bad news, consciously look for information about the direction of change. Ask yourself, is the situation improving, staying the same, or getting worse? Don't just focus on the current negative level. Think bad and better.
Got it. Look for the trend, not just the snapshot.
Precisely. Okay, let's move on to the third dramatic instinct, the straight line instinct.
Yes, this is our tendency to assume that trends will just continue in a linear fashion, either straight up or straight down indefinitely.
And the core insight here is that many, maybe even most trends don't follow straight lines. They curve.
Right.
As Rosling says, many things improve, but not in a straight line. Assuming linearity can lead to some wildly inaccurate predictions and, frankly, misunderstandings.
The book uses that funny example with a toddler named Mino, who's growing really rapidly.
Yeah, I remember that.
If he kept growing at that same rate, he'd be like gigantic by adulthood. We know that's not how human growth works. It follows an S-curve, right? It levels off.
Exactly. We get that intuitively for familiar things, but we often forget this with less familiar data. Take population growth, for instance.
Right. People often assume it will just keep going up and up exponentially, like a runaway train.
But the reality is much more complex. It's not a straight line heading for the sky.
Okay, here's another factfulness question related to this. The UN predicts a significant population increase by 2100. What's the main reason for that increase? More children being born, more adults living longer, or more very old people?
And the common guess, based on that straight line thinking.
Is more children, right? People think birth rates are just staying high or going up.
Exactly. That's the straight line assumption based on past trends and maybe from decades ago. But the correct answer is actually more adults.
More adults, how does that work?
Because the number of babies per woman has actually decreased significantly worldwide over the past few decades. It's what Rosling calls a slide-shaped curve.
A slide shape.
Yeah, it starts high, then declines quite rapidly, and then levels off at a much lower rate, typically around 2 children per woman, which is replacement level.
Ah, okay. So even though birth rates have fallen dramatically,
Right.
the population still grows for a while because all those children born during the higher fertility periods are surviving to adulthood and having their own children, even if it's fewer children each.
Precisely. It creates a larger adult population bulge. It's a curve, not a continuous upward line of babies. That peak number of children has already passed.
Interesting. So that slide shape is common.
The book highlights other examples, other slide shapes, like, say, the cost of vaccines. It drops dramatically once you get negotiated contracts and economies of scale, and then it levels out at a low price.
Okay.
And then there are hump shapes, where things actually get worse before they get better,
Like what?
like rates of tooth decay. As societies move up from level 1 to level 2 or 3, they might get more access to sugary foods before dental hygiene catches up, so decay goes up.
Uh-huh.
But then it comes down again at higher income levels with better awareness and dental care. Same with things like road accidents sometimes.
Right. Okay. So the actionable takeaway for this straight line instinct,
Yeah.
how do we combat it?
Don't just assume trends will continue in a straight line forever. When you
Mhm.
see a trend line, pause and ask yourself,
Mm.
could this be a slide shape, a hump shape,
Mm.
maybe an S-curve, or even a doubling line that eventually has to flatten?
Be aware of the different curve possibilities. Don't just draw a straight line with a ruler in your mind.
Exactly. Think curves, not just lines. Okay, number 4, the fear instinct.
This feels connected to the negativity one, maybe.
Yeah.
Our innate tendency to be afraid of certain things, snakes, spiders, heights, the things that might have been genuinely dangerous in our evolutionary past.
Definitely connected. And the core insight here is that what we fear most isn't necessarily what is most dangerous in the modern world.
Hmm.
As Rosling puts it, we fear what we are told to fear. Dramatic media coverage often amplifies these primal fears, diverting our attention and energy away from more significant, statistically larger risks.
Yeah, you see this all the time in the news cycle. A single shark attack gets huge coverage, or a
Yep.
plane crash, like we said,
Right.
even though statistically, things like heart disease or car accidents pose a far greater threat to most people on a daily basis.
Consider this question from the book. How have deaths from natural disasters changed over the last 100 years? Have they more than doubled, stayed about the same, or decreased to less than half?
Given all the news about hurricanes, earthquakes, wildfires,
Yeah.
most people would probably guess they've increased, right? Maybe doubled.
That's the common perception, fueled by fear and media focus. But the correct answer, surprisingly, is that they've decreased to less than half.
Wow.
Less than half. Yes. And if you look at it per capita, the decrease is even more dramatic, maybe down 90% or more. It's not that nature has become calmer.
Right.
It's that fewer people live in extreme poverty, level 1 vulnerability, and we have much better warning systems, infrastructure, and disaster preparedness. The Bangladesh cyclone example in the book is stark.
Yeah, the difference, improved warnings made.
Huge difference. The book also uses that great analogy of the 40 million invisible planes.
Yeah, the safe flights we never hear about.
Exactly. Millions upon millions of flights land safely every year, but we only hear about the extremely rare accidents. These safe, uneventful occurrences are invisible to us, leading to a massive overestimation of the risk of flying. Flight safety has improved dramatically.
So we really need to distinguish between what feels scary and dramatic
Yeah.
and what is actually dangerous based on the data.
Precisely. The actionable insight here is to try and suppress that initial fear instinct when evaluating risks. Look at the actual statistics. Look at the death tolls, the injury rates. Ask yourself, is this truly dangerous in proportion to the attention it gets, or is it just frightening because it's dramatic or unfamiliar or plays on those old fears?
Calculate the risk. Don't just react to the scariness.
That's a good way to put it. Okay, number 5, the size instinct.
The size instinct. This is our tendency to misjudge the importance or scale of things, often because we're presented with large numbers out of context, or we focus on single compelling stories, the identifiable victim effect, maybe.
Yes, exactly. The core insight here is that single numbers, especially big ones, can be really misleading without context. We need comparisons or proportions to understand their true significance. As Rosling says, get the sense of scale. Put numbers in perspective.
But the book gives some surprising examples of things where our sense of scale is way off, usually underestimating progress. Like, what percentage of 1-year-old children worldwide are vaccinated against some disease?
Most people guess pretty low on that one, right? Maybe 20%, 50%.
Yeah, but the actual number is around 88%.
It's amazing. Similarly, people often underestimate the proportion of the world's population with access to electricity,
Which is around 85% now.
or the number of girls finishing primary school, which we already mentioned is about 90% in most places now, not the 60% overall average, which includes the lowest income countries.
Right. And on the flip side, we can be overwhelmed by large absolute numbers without considering the relevant context, like per capita figures.
Absolutely. Think about discussions around climate change again. Hearing about China or India emitting billions of tons of CO2 can feel overwhelming and lead to blaming.
Mm-hmm.
But it's crucial to also consider per capita emissions, where many Western countries are still much higher, and also the historical responsibility for cumulative emissions. It paints a more nuanced picture.
Right. That Indian civil servant's point in the book about shifting the focus from total emissions to per-person emissions is a perfect example. It's about context and fairness.
Exactly. So the actionable step for controlling the size instinct.
Always ask for comparisons. When you see a lone number, especially a big one, ask, is that number bigger or smaller than it used to be? How does it compare to other countries, other groups, other causes?
And think in proportions. Use rates.
Yeah. Instead of just a big absolute number, ask, what percentage is that? What is the rate per person or per capita? That gives you perspective. Rosling also suggests the 80-20 rule, focus on the biggest items in any list first.
Good practical advice. Okay, instinct number 6, the generalization instinct.
This is our natural inclination to group things together, to categorize and make assumptions based on those groupings, which we kind of have to do to function, right?
We do, it's a mental shortcut. But the core insight here is that while generalizations can be useful, they can also be very misleading if they mask important differences within groups or ignore crucial similarities across seemingly different groups.
Like the developed and developing world labels we talked about earlier. Too broad.
Exactly. As Rosling says, look for differences within groups, look for similarities across groups. The 4 income levels are a much better set of categories, precisely because they allow for more nuance within and across countries.
The book really emphasizes the value of firsthand experience in challenging generalizations too. Traveling, actually seeing things for yourself.
Oh, definitely. It can really break down stereotypes. Rosling talks about his own experience as a young medical student in Bangalore,
Yeah.
where he initially made assumptions about the Indian student's knowledge based on his Swedish background, only to realize they were incredibly well-read and knowledgeable, just perhaps in different areas initially. It was a lesson in not generalizing from his own bubble.
It's so important to remember that even within a single country, let alone a continent, there can be huge differences between regions, between urban and rural areas, between different income levels. Generalizing about India or Africa is often meaningless.
Absolutely. You find similarities across countries at the same income level, like how families on level 2 might store food, whether they're in Nigeria or China, and vast differences within countries. So the actionable insights for tackling the generalization instinct.
First, question your categories. Are they too broad? Are there big differences within the group you're thinking about? Second, look for similarities across different groups you might assume are totally distinct. And third, be really cautious about generalizing from a small sample, or worse, just from your own limited experiences or from vivid examples in the media.
And remember Rosling's advice, assume people are not idiots. If you see behavior or a situation that seems strange based on your generalizations, get curious. Assume there's a smart reason behind it that you just don't understand yet, like the family saving bricks to build a house incrementally.
Right, don't just judge based on a stereotype. Okay, that leads us to number 7, the destiny instinct.
The destiny instinct. This is the idea that innate characteristics determine the destinies of people, countries, cultures, religions, that things are predetermined and cannot change because they've always been this way.
The core insight here, of course, is that things are rarely static. Change is constant, even if it's slow and gradual. As Rosling puts it, slow change is still change. Track it. Assuming a fixed destiny blinds us to real progress and potential.
Yeah, the book recounts that story of the investor who dismissed any possibility of progress in Africa, saying it had no chance because of inherent cultural factors.
A classic example of the destiny instinct locking someone into a fixed, pessimistic worldview.
Exactly. This instinct often stems from historical inertia. Things might have been a certain way for a long time, maybe even centuries, so we assume they'll always be that way. We forget that societies and cultures evolve, they adapt, they change.
And the data really challenges this idea of fixed destinies, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Look at countries like China, Bangladesh, Vietnam, even South Korea earlier. They've made incredible transformations, moving millions out of extreme poverty in a relatively short historical time frame. Things people thought were impossible just decades ago.
Even many African nations, despite the persistent negative stereotypes, have seen significant improvements in things like life expectancy, child survival, education.
That's right. The book shows data comparing life expectancy in several African countries today to Sweden back in 1970. They're comparable. That's huge progress, not destiny.
And the book also tackles the idea that factors like religion dictate destiny, showing that birth rates, for example, are much more strongly correlated with income level and access to education and contraception than with specific religious beliefs.
Right. When you look at birth rates across different religious groups at similar income levels, they're remarkably alike. Poverty, access to resources, women's empowerment, those seem to be the key drivers, not some fixed cultural or religious destiny.
So the actionable step here, how do we fight the destiny instinct?
Recognize that slow change is still meaningful change. Look for evidence of progress, even if it's gradual. Track improvements over time, don't just compare to an idealized future.
And update your knowledge.
Yes. Update your knowledge. Remember that culture is not static, it's not destiny. Societies are constantly evolving, values change, institutions adapt. Don't get stuck thinking things will always be as they are now or as they were in the past.
Keep an open mind about change. Okay, number 8, the single perspective instinct.
The single perspective instinct. This is the tendency to rely on just one idea, one ideology, or one type of expertise to understand complex issues, holding a hammer and seeing every problem as a nail.
Right. The core insight here is that no single perspective can possibly give you the full picture of a complex reality. As Rosling advises, get a toolbox, not just a hammer. Relying on just one way of thinking severely limits our understanding.
This often manifests as strong political ideology, where every issue is filtered through that one lens, or as professional bias. Experts are obviously invaluable, but sometimes they overemphasize their own field's importance or apply their specific solutions inappropriately to problems that require a broader view.
The book mentions your own experience, I think, investigating that neurological illness in Cuba.
Ah, yes. Initially, different specialists were looking only within their own fields. Nutritionists saw deficiency, toxicologists saw poison, infectious disease experts looked for a virus.
Right.
It took bringing multiple perspectives together, combining data, looking at the whole system, to eventually point towards a likely multifactorial cause involving both toxins and nutritional deficiencies. No single perspective had the answer.
And thinking that one factor, like, say, democracy, is the sole key to progress everywhere is another example of this single perspective trap.
Right, exactly. The book points to South Korea's rapid economic growth happening under an authoritarian regime, showing that development pathways can vary. Many factors interact. Focusing only on one political system as the only way can blind us to other drivers of progress, or even to progress happening under different systems.
Like the U.S. spending vastly more on healthcare per capita, but not necessarily having the best health outcomes compared to countries with different systems. The best solution isn't always found through one single model.
Well said. So, the actionable steps to counter the single perspective instinct.
Be wary of simple ideas and simple solutions to complex problems. Actively seek out and welcome complexity and different perspectives.
Talk to people who disagree with you.
Yes. Test your ideas. Look at them from different angles, consult experts, but be aware of their potential biases and limitations. Don't just listen to the person with a hammer.
And use numbers and data, but always combine them with real-world context and stories to understand the nuances. Don't rely only on the numbers or only on the anecdotes. Get the whole picture.
Good advice.
Yeah.
Okay, 9th instinct, the blame instinct.
The blame instinct, our powerful urge to find someone or something to hold responsible when things go wrong, to point the finger.
It feels satisfying sometimes, doesn't it? To find a villain. But the core insight here is that focusing on blame often vastly oversimplifies complex problems and distracts us from understanding the real, often systemic causes and finding effective solutions.
As Rosling says, when things go wrong, don't look for a scapegoat, look for causes. Blaming an individual often prevents us from seeing the bigger picture.
The book uses that anecdote of the student wanting to punch pharmaceutical company executives because certain diseases affecting the poor are neglected.
Yeah, a powerful emotional reaction, completely understandable. But blaming the CEO ignores the complex web of market forces, research costs, regulatory hurdles, government policies, and poverty itself that contribute to that problem. It's rarely just one person's fault.
And we see this with climate change too, right? Blaming specific countries or industries, while potentially valid to some extent, can obscure the systemic nature of our global energy system and consumption patterns, as well as the historical context.
Exactly. And blaming foreigners or specific groups for outbreaks of disease is a classic, ancient, and almost always unhelpful reaction driven by this instinct.
The book also points out that we often overestimate the power of individuals, both for bad and for good. We look for heroes and villains.
Right. The Ebola outbreak response, for example, wasn't really down to one heroic leader. It was the collective, often unheralded, effort of thousands of local health workers, logisticians, community leaders, international responders. It was a system, a collective effort.
And major improvements in quality of life often come from broad technological or social advancements, not just the actions of one brilliant individual. Rosling credits the washing machine for liberating huge amounts of time for his mother and grandmother.
A fantastic example, more impactful than many famous leaders, perhaps. So, the actionable insight for the blame instinct.
Resist the urge to find a simple scapegoat. When something goes wrong, look for the systems and the multiple interacting causes behind the problem, not just a single villain. Ask, how did the system allow this to happen? Rather than just, whose fault is it?
Focus on understanding the system to prevent recurrence rather than just punishing an individual.
Exactly. Okay, finally, the 10th dramatic instinct, the urgency instinct.
The urgency instinct, that feeling that we must act immediately, right now, when faced with perceived danger or dramatic negative information, now or never.
The core insight here is the need to recognize the difference between genuine immediate emergencies that require instant action and slower-moving trends or potential future risks where rushing can be counterproductive.
As Rosling advises, take a breath. When people say things are urgent, ask what data they have and check the data yourself. Don't let the feeling of urgency override careful analysis.
Activists, salespeople, the media. They often use urgency deliberately to grab attention, bypass critical thinking, and push for immediate action or decisions, right?
Absolutely. It's a powerful tool, a limited time offer, impending crisis. But sometimes a more measured, data-driven response is far more effective than a panicked reaction based on incomplete or hyped-up information.
The book mentions the slow, gradual pace of global energy transition. While climate change is urgent in the long term, calls for immediate, drastic overhauls that ignore the realities of the current system might be unrealistic or even harmful if not thought through carefully.
Right. And the story from Mozambique during the Konzo outbreak investigation,
Ah, yes, the paralysis.
where initial pronouncements about the cause were made very quickly, driven by urgency, but more careful data collection and investigation were needed to understand the complex reality and find the right interventions. Rushing led down the wrong path initially.
It highlights the importance of resisting that pressure to have an immediate answer or solution when dealing with complex issues.
And Rosling makes a poignant contrast. The urgency often applied to potential future risks like climate change versus the lack of sufficient urgency applied to the ongoing present suffering caused by extreme poverty, for which we actually have proven solutions ready to implement now.
That's a really important point. Where should the real urgency lie?
Indeed. So the actionable steps for managing the urgency instinct.
Take a deep breath when you feel that pressure to act immediately. Insist on seeing the data behind the urgent claims.
Be wary of fortune tellers predicting exact futures and skeptical of drastic solutions proposed under pressure. Ask about potential side effects.
Exactly. And recognize that complex problems often require gradual, persistent effort and monitoring, not just a single, dramatic, urgent intervention. Slow progress is often more sustainable and effective. Don't let urgency lead to panic.
Wise words. So, to wrap things up, we've gone through these 10 dramatic instincts that Hans Rosling identified. Gap, negativity, straight line, fear, size, generalization, destiny, single perspective, blame, and urgency.
It's quite a list. And understanding them, recognizing when our brain is defaulting to these shortcuts, is really the key to developing what he calls factfulness, a more accurate, less stressful way of seeing the world.
And for you, our listener, hopefully this deep dive provides some practical tools. It's about navigating the flood of information more effectively, making better decisions perhaps, and, well, maybe feeling a bit less overwhelmed or cynical about the state of the world.
Yes, start trying to apply these factfulness habits consciously. When you see a statistic, especially a shocking one, ask for context and comparisons.
Right. When you hear a broad generalization, actively look for differences within the group and similarities with other groups.
When you encounter bad news, which you will pause and ask, what's the trend? Is this situation bad but actually getting better?
Reflect on which of these instincts you personally find most challenging. Maybe it's the negativity bias or perhaps the urge to blame. Becoming more factful is definitely a continuous practice, not a one-time fix.
Absolutely. But it's a practice that Rosling argues leads to a more accurate, more nuanced, and ultimately less stressful view of reality. Less panic, more constructive action.
So perhaps a final thought for you to consider as you go about your week. Which of these instincts trips you up the most often in your daily life when consuming news or making judgments? And how might actively working on that one instinct change your perspective or decisions going forward?